Hello all and welcome to today's Risk Out webinar, Beyond the Buzzword, the do's and don'ts of AI and AML. We are so excited to have you joining us here today. Now, before we do dive into today's webinar content, we want to roll through a quick few housekeeping items. Risk Out will be sharing all of today's webinar resources in a follow-up email for you tomorrow morning, so be sure to keep an eye on your inbox. In the meantime, you can find those downloadable materials, including the slides, as well as some additional accompaniments in the materials portion of the GoToWebinar interface. We also want this session to be as valuable for you as possible, so we encourage you to ask any questions that you might have throughout today's session in the questions section of the webinar interface. We will also be running a handful of polls throughout today's webinar to better understand you all, our audience, so your participation is greatly appreciated. And for those of us that are joining us for the first time, Risk Out is a team of former bank examiners, BSA professionals, and fintech developers helping financial institutions grow to be more efficient and profitable. Through a full BSA, AML, and fraud suite, Risk Out solutions increase revenue and decrease compliance costs and fraud losses by unlocking new deposit streams, automating compliance workflows, and by catching bad actors. If you're interested in learning more about how we help community banks and credit unions every day, visit riskout.com and get in touch. I am excited to share that Risk Out recently released an all-new case study about our robust BSA AML solution. This case study walks through how Wells River Savings Bank up in Vermont reduced manual workloads, simplified investigations, and improved exam readiness, all while strengthening oversight across their higher risk business areas. Visit our website to hear directly from the bank's CEO, or you can look at the materials section of GoToWebinar now to download. Now, I know we're all thinking about it. NACHA, it's updating its rules, and those are going into effect starting in March, and that is only 5 months away. That's why we just opened registrations for our next webinar, ACH Evolution, preparing for NACHA's 2026 rule changes. These new rules will require financial institutions to enhance ACH risk monitoring, fraud detection, and third-party oversight. In this session, we'll break down what's changing, why it matters, and how you can prepare. Visit riskout.com today to save your seat, or look at the chat box and you can register there. Today's webinar will be led by Ryan McInerney, Riskout's Chief Product Officer, and Haig Duzjan, an AI business founder and product leader. Ryan leverages his extensive regulatory and technical background to create software solutions that solve critical industry problems. Before joining Risk Out, Ryan served as a national bank examiner at the OCC, where he was a key member of the Northeast District Committees for Compliance and Commercial Credit, working to address challenges facing community banks. Haig served as an AI lead at multiple credit scoring organizations and drove products at Llama Index, a leading platform for AI agents. He now focuses on product and AI at The Browser Company and has extensive experience in building AI agents for major US banks. We are very excited to have them both joining us today. Without further ado, I will go ahead and pass the baton over to Ryan to dive into today's webinar content. Ryan, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Ethan. Great to be here today, and thanks to Haig for joining on with us. So just wanted to kind of run through a little bit of what the agenda is. We're going to be going through the different types of AI that we're working on, data privacy, what we actually want to look at when we're vetting vendors, and just identifying if it's the right person that we want to be working with, which leads directly into what snake oil might be in those areas. Before we jump in, though, I just wanted to give Haig a chance to introduce himself. It's the first time y'all are meeting him, so.
Thanks, Ryan. Hey, everyone. My name is Haig. I'm a former software engineer turned product person. At one point, I started a company, and now I build AI agents and AI products for those in the fintech industry. It's nice to meet you all.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for that. That does lead us into our first poll question, which you should see popping up on your screen now. Before we get too in the weeds, We want to understand who all we have on the call here today and how you're actively leveraging AI. So this question says, how would you describe your institution's current use of AI? And that could be everything from you're actively using those tools, maybe you're exploring them, maybe you're curious but cautious, and that's why you're here to learn a little bit more, or maybe you're not using it at all and you have no plans to in the future. I'll give y'all just a couple more seconds to get your answers in before these turn these around and let our speakers give their 2 cents. All right, excellent. Thank you for all of those. So we should see those responses coming up on the screen. And it looks like almost 50% of our audience, almost half of our respondents said that they're very curious, but they're also very cautious. Followed up, we have 22% that are exploring AI options, 19% that have no plans to use them down the road, and 11% that are actively using them. Ryan, let me start off with you here. How does this kind of stack up with what you were expecting to see?
I think this definitely lines up with what I would expect. It's you know, there's a lot of talk about using AI tools, but actually figuring out how it's going to apply and the right solution for it can take a lot of work and a lot of effort. So it's great to see some people are already doing that, and as others are actively exploring it or even just trying to learn about it, that does set you up to be in the best place in the future. So that's all. It's great that you guys are here, even thinking about it. Hi, any thoughts from you?
Yeah. I've done quite a few of these, and we've seen this across the board with a lot of industries. I would say it's more relevant in those industries that have higher impact and where AI must be more precise. So this aligns pretty well with that.
Perfect. Well, that will take us into our types of AI and machine learning. I'll throw it back over to y'all.
Awesome. So really quickly, before we kick off everything, we're going to go through kind of what is AI. And my goal here is to break it down and dumb it down to make it really, really easy to digest. If there are any questions at all, feel free to interrupt, and we're going to go from there. So there's multiple forms of AI that come into the picture here. We have predictive AI and we have generative AI. Now, predictive AI is more historical. It's what we've been using up until about 10 years ago. This is anything from credit scores to predicting housing markets to predicting fraud, etc. And this is typically using traditional machine learning. Now, in 2018, a paper was released called the Transformer model, and this is where generative AI really kicked off. In 2020 or 2021, ChatGPT was released, and then things started taking hold. So we're going to go through a couple slides here, touching on what is predictive AI, what is generative AI. We're going to talk about why quality is so important, data quality is so important as AI begins to develop and begins to be used across these industries. And then really quickly at the end, we're going to touch on what is human in the loop. And I think that human in the loop is most relevant to what you folks are doing today in the industries. So without further ado, we can probably kick off what predictive AI is. Now, at a high level, and you can kind of ignore the text here, I'm just going to be monologuing. At a high level, predictive AI leverages historical data, and given that historical data, we're able to actually predict with high confidence kind of future values of these things. So you can think a house, for example. We're able to actually take in information from houses across your industry or across your neighborhood, maybe across your county, maybe within the state that you're in, and we're able to actually predict future house value using those historical figures. Now, that's just one example of it. You can think of fraud as another example. Given fraud as it relates to AML, we're able to actually digest a bunch of information about previous actors and previous information, whether it relates to you or relates to the actual industry in general. And then we're able to predict with a high accuracy whether or not this person is, with high confidence, going to invoke some sort of fraud in the future. These are just small little examples of what predictive machine learning or predictive AI can actually leverage. And it's been tried and true quite significantly in the industry so far. Now, Ryan, anything to add here?
I think it's funny seeing some of the references to predictive AI as it's this brand new thing, and it, to your point, has been around a lot longer than I think people realize it has. And at the end of the day, it's statistics, and that always kind of has a foundation when we're looking at banking.
Yeah, totally agree. And we see use cases of predictive AI across the board. Credit scoring, fraud. There's many other examples. If any of you are on social media or any of you are purchasing things and see ads, there's a lot of predictive AI involved in those decision-making processes. And it's kind of been a great segue into what generative AI is. So generative AI, you can think like ChatGPT. And I think if I were to go back and see the poll somewhere, quite a few of you seem familiar with what ChatGPT is. You might be users of ChatGPT, but you don't really understand what's going on under the hood. So really quickly at a high level, essentially ChatGPT is what's referred to as a neural network. And I won't jump into the jargon there, but it essentially has gathered all the information on the internet, and it's broken it down into one of these machine learning models, a new form of machine learning model. And with that information, we're actually able to generate future words and future values, and it's able to articulate, given your prompt, it's able to find historical data, it's able to present maybe a more summarized version of that data. So when we look at text, for example, as a modality, we're able to gather all of this internet data, and I'm able to ask this ChatGPT a question. Hey, tell me a bit more about Risk Scout, for example. And what it can do is then find information that it's already gathered and trained on, and it'll be able to present me with a really short, concise version of what Risk Scout is, and maybe some of its offerings and some of its product lines. Now it's able to do that by generating the next token. That's why we call it generative AI. So generating the next token essentially just means generating the next character or the next word, and it's able to articulate its thoughts much more clearly. Now, the number one thing that generative AI has done is it's essentially been able to take the learnings of the human brain and spit those out into some sort of AI. So a lot of the development around generative AI has been reflected on the learnings of the brain and how humans actually interact and how humans actually think. And it's pretty astonishing seeing the results over the last 8 years since ChatGPT, or sorry, 5 years since ChatGPT has been released, kind of where this technology is going and where it will be in the future. And we can touch on that in a bit. The number one thing that this has allowed us to do is understand a bit more about the patterns and the relationships between data. So we see it with text, but we also see, there's video generation tools, there's audio generation tools, there's text generation tools. In the very near future, we're starting to see these monolithic, like very, very large types of models that are able to do many multiple things in different modalities, which is not something we were seeing with predictive AI. So that's why it's so neat. It's unlocking a new treasure, essentially. Ryan, anything to add there?
I think you nailed it there.
Cool. So if we go to the next slide, and apologies ahead of time. I know this is highly technical, so please ask questions if anything is confusing. Why is data so important? So we keep coming back to, okay, for predictive AI and for generative AI, data is at the core. Now, when you look at companies like OpenAI who created ChatGPT, they have spent billions and billions of dollars on gathering the right amount of data and making sure it's clean enough to be trained on these models. And the same has been done for a lot of predictive engines, such as credit scores, fraud, etc. Data itself is the most important because it's kind of the food of the model. So if you think about humans, if we eat healthy and we work out, we do fitness, we get in sunlight, etc., we're able to actually gain benefits from that, right? The same is said for models. So if we give it good data, it's going to be good results. If we give it bad data, it's going to be really, really bad results. So why OpenAI has spent billions of dollars on cleaning data and gathering data is relevant to how the models will perform at the end of the day. Now, there's different forms of leveraging this data, and that's what you see on the screen right now. So there's supervised learning, which is the concept of given maybe 100 questions and answers, I, as a human, have gone in and I've labeled them. And what labeling means, annotating, is essentially I have checked the question and I have checked the answer, and I've confirmed that both of those things are good. Both of those things match, they're working, it's the correct answer to that question. And then I go to the next one and the next one. And then when we train the model, it's essentially given, hey, here is what a good question looks like. Here's what a good answer to that question looks like. And I'm able to articulate and fit in these puzzle pieces of figuring out that this thing will work for future questions similar to those that it's already seen. So it learns from what it's already seen. And that's what supervised learning is. And if we jump to unsupervised learning, this is, hey, I've been given questions, but I don't have the answers. Now, unsupervised learning is essentially the concept of I need to do some pattern matching as a model. I've given some information, but I don't have the whole picture. So I need to figure out where this missing piece is. And you can think of things like customer segmentation, for example. So if I have a bunch of customers and they're coming in, I don't have time nor even the capability of understanding where all these customers are and what their segments are and everything in between. I have to rely on pattern matching. And that's where unsupervised learning really fits into the picture there. Now, to just talk about the two, these are core concepts in machine learning and data science, but supervised learning is highly costly because it takes time to actually label this data and create the data. Unsupervised learning is not very costly because you don't spend so much time cleaning it up and creating it. But what comes with those is supervised learning is very accurate. Unsupervised learning is not very accurate. And those come with their own little cons and pros. But essentially what I'm trying to relate here is with supervised learning and with unsupervised learning, there are different approaches that you would take depending on the problem that you're trying to solve. Now, really quickly, just to touch on what reinforcement learning is. Reinforcement learning is the concept of trial and error. So given this thing, it's able to assign a reward system to it. And if it gets correct answers, or if it gets not correct answers, it'll get a reward based on that. And correct answers are typically given by a AI nowadays, or in the past, it was given by a human coming in and actually checking the work and making sure it was done correctly. And as time goes on with reinforcement learning, these models become better and better and better. And one quick anecdote about that is over the past 5 years, since ChatGPT has come out, it has gotten progressively better, not just because of the supervised learning and unsupervised learning approaches taken within those model trainings, but also because with usage and with iteration and those little thumbs up and thumbs down buttons you see, it's gotten better and learned from these things over time. I won't touch on self-supervised right now, but Ryan, anything to add there?
Not too much there. I think it was interesting when I was at Treasury, and that's probably 8 years ago, we were talking a little bit about unsupervised learning, and there's all this concern about not knowing what is actually linking to the result. And so you could see maybe a regulator getting concerned that they don't understand the explainability behind something. So it can always be valuable when you're thinking about whatever models you're using, that the explainability is there. And that's a lot of the reason that Haig and I wanted to talk about this just generally, to give you all some more information about what is going into these models and kind of some of the questions you should be able to ask if you have a deck like this to use as a reference.
Yeah.
Hey, Ryan, sorry, before we move on here, we did get a question, and as you have been a bank examiner in the past, I think this might be better suited for you. One of our audience members asked if this is the kind of level of understanding they're expected to have when their examiners do come around and ask questions about the systems they're using. For example, should I know if my solution leverages supervised or unsupervised, reinforced or self-supervised, or self-supervised? How would you respond to that? If you were examiner, what would you want to ask?
I think what the examiner cares about is that you know what information is being used to make a decision. All of the ins and outs of how that's actually determined behind the scenes isn't going to be what they're focused on. It's that you know what's happening, and that you know the information being used is information that's allowed to be used, essentially. That could be talking about some of these learning types. It's probably not. That's probably more in the weeds than you need to get.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Keep on moving here.
Yeah. Really quickly, just to add on to what Ryan said, from what I have seen in the regulatory space, especially related to fintech or finance as it relates to these large banks or credit unions, a lot of the time the learning mechanisms of how the data is actually being trained on the models, or maybe pre-trained or post-trained on the models, isn't as relevant. What's relevant is the data going in, just to double click on what Ryan was saying earlier, where that data is coming from, whether or not it has any PII data within it, has it been filtered and cleaned, etc. And that's where a lot of the work is actually being done by previously humans, and nowadays AIs are helping with that process to make it faster and better. So yeah, very, very good question there. And the last thing I'm going to touch on here is human in the loop. How can I say this? So human in the loop, otherwise referred to as HITL when you shorten it. HITL is one of my core areas of focus. This is related to the feedback loop between, hey, an AI presented this thing in a very high risk space. So you can think credit scoring, right? There is no room for error there. So any type of AI development or any type of AI output requires a human to come in to actually ensure that it's not just 95% accurate or 98% accurate. It has to be 99.9999% accurate all the time. So why that's so important is when you see adoption of AI in highly regulated industries, it's really, really important that these models are accurate, but it's also really important that there's hands-on human feedback in the process and also in the results. So just to touch on a few of those phases, just to give you guys examples of this, humans are in the loop in 4 different phases typically, and that's design and data prep. So like we touched on, you're labeling the data, you're confirming that the data is clean and there's no PII information or any type of indication within the data. It's filtered down, so it's working quite well. There's no noise, etc. When it comes to model training and kind of where things are, there's something called red teaming that's very common nowadays, and that's essentially going into the data and ensuring that it's the right amount of data. You can't ask questions that might be causing issues with the model or maybe trying to get some not so good results with the model. You can think of things like with ChatGPT, people asking to make bombs, for example, or something that you don't want to actually have in the results. In terms of operational use, and that's kind of where red teaming really fits in, but in terms of operational use, for credit scoring, for example, an underwriter might see a credit score, might receive a credit report from an AI product, and their goal is to then go in and determine whether or not that AI result was accurate for their use case. And as time goes on, there's always going to be this continuous feedback loop, right? So if it wasn't so accurate, you might be able to tell the model why it wasn't so accurate, and through iteration, it'll actually get better and better and maybe more personalized and optimized to your use case. Ryan, anything to add there?
No, I think that's a great way to describe it. I mean, the idea by having a human in that process is that we can make sure the results are what we expect. And over time, it's easier to do that. And to Haig's point, it's funny that that is even being kind of disintermediated by AI taking over some of those roles. In AML and community banks particularly, sometimes you'll see this human in the loop in a more present way, where you really want to maintain a lot of explainability, and maybe there's not 100% trust in just letting the AI make the decision just because of the regulatory burden there. So you can just see this be a little bit more prevalent in some of the products you might be exposed to.
Yeah, very true. And one last thing to add here, I at Llama Index, so for those that aren't familiar with Llama Index, we are a framework that's sold to all developers building in the AI space, and we became known for building AI agents or giving tools to build AI agents. We didn't touch on AI agents here, but essentially agents are just another fancy way of saying, I have this manual workflow as a human, and I built AI to actually automate that workflow. And there's a multi-step AI process involved, and that's what an agent is. It's agentic. So a great example of human in the loop here. When I was speaking with a very, very large bank, one of the largest banks in the world, one of our customers, we had to build some sort of process to automate document ingestion. So for example, maybe a consumer would come in and submit a bunch of documents to this bank as proof for something. Our goal was to gather all of those documents, ingest them, parse them, make them so they're actually machine readable, no longer just handwriting, but something that a machine can understand. So we convert it into actual text. And then what we can do from there is actually automate some of the back office operations going on. So for example, underwriters, they have to come in and they have to do a bunch of stuff. We would automate that process and we would spit it back into them in a highly digestible way. Now, human in the loop is really important there in multiple steps. Once when we ingest that data, the underwriter needs to come in and actually confirm that it was ingested appropriately. So confirming step 1, and then once the decision has been made by the agent, the human in the loop process kicks off again, and they have to confirm that it was actually the correct result. Now, it sounds like a lot of work for humans, but essentially it's taking what they used to do over an hour down to maybe 5 to 10 minutes, which is a big, big, big win. So one last thing to leave with you guys on this human in the loop step is the goal with AI is never to really replace humans for a majority of things. The goal is to augment your processes and your manual workflows so that you don't have to spend 2 hours doing something. You spend 2 minutes doing something. And that's the ultimate goal for anyone building AI agents in highly risk heavy spaces. So yeah. And I think, Ryan, maybe you can take this guy on.
Yeah. So just kind of summarizing what we've gone over through predictive and generative AI. A lot of the times these models for you all are going to be in these domains. So when you're looking at the predictive side, the risk models, anomaly detection, which would be, say, things like fraud, anti-money laundering, and typology, which would be identifying, say, like types of customers or members. That's still very much relevant from the predictive AI side. I think there's been so much focus on generative that people are forgetting that the predictive side is still incredibly important for this industry. On the generative side, typically what you're going to see for that actually being used is some of these co-pilots, which might be helping with like understanding regulation or guidance or maybe changes that are coming up, interpreting those predictive results and helping you to become more accurate with that. So you might see multi-layers of the different types of AI, similar to what Haig's talked about there. And then on the site, things like SAR narratives, written support, generative AI is incredibly good at that. And again, it's just something that helps to reduce the amount of time that you need to spend on things.
All right, that brings us to our next poll question, which you should see popping up on your screen shortly. That is asking you, how confident are you that you could explain an AI model's decisions to an examiner? That ranges from everything from being very confident, somewhat confident, not very confident, or, the very honest answer of just being not confident at all. Give y'all a couple seconds to get in here, and no matter where you're landing on the spectrum, the good news is Ryan and Haig are going to help y'all out, hopefully get a little bit closer to that very confident before the end of our hour today. All right, y'all are quick on the draw on this one. Let me go ahead and turn these results around. I don't think these are too surprising, but Haig, I want to hear from you and get your thoughts. Not very confident coming in as our majority answer, 45%. That's followed up by not at all confident, 32%. Only 2% of our folks on the call today feel very confident. Fortunately, about 20% are kind of in that middle section of somewhat. Haig, I know you've mentioned you've worked with some very large US banks. How did this kind of stack up with what you're expecting to see based on the bankers you've worked with in the past?
Yeah, this is very indicative of what I've seen in the space. This is across both fintech and healthcare and insurance and pretty much any FSI company that I've spoken with. What I will say here is the goal of any product person in AI is education is number one. Education and safety and security, but education is number one, which is how can we actually digest this information so that you guys can actually take this and go do something with it, and be able to have confidence around your descriptions and decision making behind that. So very indicative. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing that. I think that brings us over to data privacy. Ryan, I'll let you speak to this a little bit.
All right. So, I mean, we already had I think we had one question earlier talking about PII, and PII is probably one of the most important things that comes up with AI. I think it's something that really concerns people that their information might be going into any of these models and then what's being done with that information. So some of the things just to think about those primary concerns. Is there unauthorized access? I mean, if you've made the vendor somebody that has authorized access, that's an allowable approach. But is it being stored in places you don't know about, or is it being reproduced in a way you don't intend? Haig had talked about training models not to refer to information that they might not be supposed to be referring to. And so if I had PII that was passed into a model, am I sure that somebody else can't ask a question about that and then get information about the PII out? Some other things that we might see there is whether or not the information is used in the scope with which it should be used. One problem that we had seen in the past when I was at Treasury was different models were basically intuiting prohibited factors. So maybe you might not be able to discriminate based on race, but they've determined a causal link between last name and race, and then they were using last name as a factor, and by accident, they were discriminating on race. So it's important to know what's being used and kind of why it's important to the model. And that also just leads directly into explainability. And I think it's also important to point out that anybody that you're working with on these, whether it's a vendor or if it's somebody internally, they should be able to explain to you what's going on. And if you're getting in answers that are, well, that's just the way it works, that's not really the best answer. That's not something you should accept. Typically, someone understands it if they can explain it to you. And if they can't explain it to you, they probably don't understand it. So it's kind of a good baseline to have. So I think the biggest question when you're thinking about using AI, any model, or really any process within your institution is, do I even need PII to achieve the goal that I'm going for? The idea of least privilege, right, having the least amount of sensitive information going into something is one that still is applicable in this space. And there are options for you to take the information that you're passing in and try and make it a little bit more less sensitive. You can mask, tokenize, pseudonymize the data. And if you're doing something like that, it can just make it so it's less risky. Another item there is, does the information actually need to persist after the fact? Once it's been used, does it need to be saved somewhere, or can it be a one-time value that's passed in? So these are just a couple examples of things that you can ask. There's going to be a lot of content in this deck that is really meant to be kind of a guide for you all as you're starting to evaluate vendors or processes. Go through, ask these questions to maybe your team or maybe to somebody that you're thinking about working with. Hi, do you have anything you'd add on, I guess, just using PII like this in general?
Yeah, I would say, and I don't want to speak for everyone's products, but I would say for a majority of products, at least the ones I have seen, PII data, we've spent a lot of time cleaning it out, making sure it's anonymous, ensuring that that data actually never goes into the model in the training phase or is never actually used in any of the model outputs. If your team, whether it is an internal team or a vendor, isn't putting a large emphasis on this, I think this is something that requires it and is something that you should be pushing for in the end of the day.
Hey, sorry, before we move on, we did get another question I think is a good one to ask before we leave PII. And they were asking, is this anonymization something that people use tools for? Is this something that happens manually, or is this something that some of these tools will do on their own? I guess, how do you actually go about making your PII anonymous or different enough to kind of meet this data privacy threshold that we're trying to achieve?
Yeah, I would say a lot of people are using a tool or a process for this, where they're saying, I have X customer name coming out, and before that customer name is provided to the next step, I turn it into a token or something else that internally I could link back, but the individual that's receiving the name, which is now a token, does not know what the name actually was that was associated to it. So frequently, I think you're going to see a tool. You could do it manually, theoretically. That sounds less pleasant, in my opinion. I don't know if you have any thoughts there, but
yeah, there are encoding tools. There's open source frameworks. There's a bunch of things here that can be easily leveraged to actually remove any type of PII information. The goal at the end of the day is to ensure that anytime it's entering the model, you remove it. Anytime the result comes back out, you can then push it back into the end user. You just don't want this information actually being utilized for any further training or further benefit of other users as well. So.
That's great to hear. Yeah, I was afraid we spooked some of our audience of more time in spreadsheets. So glad to hear that's not the case on that front. Thanks. I'll throw it back to y'all.
All right. So if you are using PII, these are theories that apply outside of AI. They're just kind of broadly applicable to this space, but it's a good reminder of when to think about them. Role-based access control, I think we are all well aware of when and when not that is applicable. And in this case, it is certainly applicable. Different filters that you can actually just layer onto a prompt, or different ways to reduce the amount of information that's coming back out of the model. Both of those can be definitely used in this case. We've gone through tokenization, on-premise versus the private cloud. If you do anything on-prem, the effort is going to be higher, but you do have more control over the data in that case. I can't tell you when or when not to use those approaches, but as you start to go through these conversations with vendors or internally, it can be an easier place to make a decision on things like that. And then the last is just different ways that you can use the learning approaches to try and reduce the amount of PII that is going to be actually available.
All right, before we get too deep into actually how to practically vet the vendors, we have another poll that is coming up on your screen, which is asking, why are you even going to a vendor in the first place? What is your top goal for implementing AI at your financial institution? It can be anything from saving time, reducing manual work, maybe it's data analysis, maybe if you're using it for transaction monitoring, it's a lot of false positives, or just improving detection accuracy to actually get those alerts at all in the first place. Would love to hear from the audience what they're doing, or maybe it's that other option. It's something entirely different that we just didn't even list here. We'll give you all a couple more seconds to get your responses in. Ooh, interesting. Definitely a more heavily weighted one way than I was anticipating. So this will be interesting to talk about. Alrighty, most people got their responses in, so we'll turn these around. It looks like we've got 61% of our folks saying that they're really using it to save time and reduce manual work. We're about tied for the number 2 slot there on either improving detection accuracy or reducing false positives. I know a lot of times those two things can go hand in hand. And then finally, we've got only 3% saying either other or that they're focusing on deep data analysis. Ryan, let me throw this one to you. How does this kind of compare to what you see people using AI for?
I mean, I think this makes the most sense. We're all trying to save time. We have enough on our plates where anywhere that you can get a minute back, you want that minute back. It's funny though, I think when you look at any of these, they're all meant to save time, right? Like I'm trying to improve detection accuracy so that I spend less time on false positives. Anything that we're building typically is meant to make our lives more efficient. So it makes sense to me that that would be the most popular there.
Well said.
Anything from you, Hag?
Yeah, and just one more thing to add in here. Improving data detection accuracy, reducing false positives, even reducing manual work, like we touched on earlier with human in the loop, this is where a lot of that work becomes very important. Improving detection accuracy over time using reinforcement learning from human in the loop interactions ultimately do help a lot of these buckets here. So hopefully the goal out of this presentation is at the end of the day, you realize that with a lot of these systems and with a lot of these products, you're actually able to accomplish all 3 of those first topics, which is really exciting in my head. So.
Excellent. Well, let's get into figuring out how we can get those results from the vendors through some good questions. Ryan, I'll let you dive back in.
All right. I am not going to run through every single question on this, but the intention behind a lot of the next few slides is what are the things that you can ask where you should get a legitimate answer back so you can make an informed decision. A lot of those questions are going to be around model transparency. So we've talked about this probably ad nauseum, but it's, does this make sense? Can you explain it? From the validation side of things, if you look at any of the guidance that's coming from the regulators on this, this has been in place prior to AI, generative AI being in the loop. It's, are you making sure that the information you're passing in is accurate? And then are you back testing that to make sure the results that you're getting make sense relative to what you should be getting? And are you improving that over time? Whether that's altering what you're using or maybe adjusting the thresholds that you're using for that detection or that analysis. Ethics, governance, this all goes back to the PII side. It also goes back to, are you taking any of that information and using it for something that maybe it wasn't intended for? And if you are doing that, is that permissible? So those are all really important things to think about. So generally, I think your IT department, probably your vendor management department is going to want to ask questions about this. I would recommend for any of these putting together maybe a questionnaire or an addendum that's any of your third-party vendor selection that might have questions about AI. Is it used in the product? If it is used, how is it used in the product, and what information does it require? These are all kind of general questions that you would ask from a third-party vendor perspective anyways. So continue to ask those and also wrap it into the AI questions.
And just to iterate how important these questions are, they seem very basic, but anytime we were trying to sell to a large bank or anytime we were selling to anyone in the FSI industry, we would get these questions plus 100 more around how this data is actually moving and interacting and so on. So very, very important, and I'm happy Ryan put this together for y'all.
Hey, sorry, before we move on here, we got a question asking, are these questions that most AI vendors have already answered, slash is there a place that I can go find these on people's websites, or should I be asking these on calls or demos as I'm evaluating partners?
I'll give my answer and then I'll let Hyde give his, given he would actually be the vendor. But typically they've answered these before, but I doubt that it's going to be something that you can just go to their site and say, oh, let me grab the answers to their third-party risk questionnaire. Usually, like when we're asked for information, we provide a packet that's our due diligence, and that will go through generally a lot of these questions, and then we'll, on an ad hoc basis, answer questions that might not have been already included in that packet.
Yeah, totally agree. A majority of vendors don't have this readily available. They have to do it ad hoc for each one of their customers. Some vendors are able to use companies like Vanta if they have a security portal somewhere there that they can send over. We ended up spending so much time doing it ad hoc that we built out our own portal just to help move this along. So yeah, it's a great question.
Okay. Testing, we've got a few different options here. It's definitely not going to be fully inclusive of all the different ways that you can test, but I would recommend anytime you're using any of this, making sure you have some type of overlap period or some type of flexibility where you can make sure this is working the way you want it to be working prior to actually needing to release it into production. A lot of times we'll see that with a sandbox or a pilot. And then that also helps if you maintain another solution at the same time, whether that's a manual process or something else, you can use that as a baseline and start to identify deviations. It can be difficult to identify some of those if you don't have kind of a one-to-one comparison relative to your normal process. Edge cases, those could be things that involve, say, one-off account types or one-off maybe spellings of names, addresses, just kind of weird things that maybe whoever created the model or whoever built the process wasn't expecting some of that stuff to come in. So if you know of edge cases, asking those and bringing those forward during the contracting process is going to be hugely valuable to not only you, but to the vendor as well. And then lastly, some of the other ones here, validating those outputs, checking if it's explainable and documenting that. Those are all going to be things that your regulators, your auditors want, but it's also something that you should be putting together to bring to, say, the board or management committee, just making sure that you can explain even what you're doing and get that buy-in from the rest of the team. I think that one's particularly important if you're trying to implement something like this and maybe everyone at the financial institution isn't totally on board with that. So if you want to sway people to your side, document it, show that you've gone through the process to understand it, and you've actually kind of started to hone that in as well. Anything to add there, Hyde?
Yeah, totally agree with everything Ryan's saying here. The fortunate thing about all of these tests and all of these questionnaires is the upfront lift is costly. However, once you've done it, it's there for repeated use. So it's worth the effort putting into it.
Okay. On here, we're just talking about black box versus glass box. Basically, the idea is you should be able to understand what's going into the model. Again, we've talked about that a lot, but I keep putting these in here just so you have them as reference in the future. I think typically you're going to want to push towards the glass box side, but not everything is going to be able to be in that glass box. There's typically going to be something that's a little opaque. So just trying to get as much information as you can.
And one quick thing to add there, and I know we're short on time, so I'll be quick. As it relates to generative AI and it relates to these neural networks like ChatGPT, there is a lot of black box happening in those algorithms where we simply don't know why certain things happen or why it's giving the results that it is. But everything going in and everything coming out, you typically can start relaying to certain mechanisms. So don't be fooled if somebody comes back to you and says, "Oh, we don't know the answer to that." Most of the time, you know what's going in. So.
Okay. So the main two ideas on the snake oil piece here, is it jargon that you're hearing from the vendor, or maybe not even a vendor, but you've just heard in an article or something like that, or is it an actual solution that's usable? And then the second piece there is, are you actually solving for a problem? Or are you just seeing something that's shiny and you kind of want to put it into place because it's shiny, which I think we can all be guilty of sometimes. So one of the quotes, which I guess really isn't a quote by anyone other than Abe Lincoln potentially, is a real AI solution should produce measurable gains that justify its complexity relative to the simplest approach. We've looked several times at different areas that we thought about putting AI into risk out, for example, and then it was, well, I don't even need to do that. I can just call this other field and put that together myself, and it's way less complex and it's going to be easier for you all to understand and bring forward to a regulator. So a lot of times just thinking about, does this actually need to be AI? Does it actually benefit me? And there's a ton of use cases where that's the case, but it's not always the case. Okay, so some questions that you can ask your team, yourselves, when you're trying to decide, does AI actually belong in that process? So is there repeatable human decision-making? Haig and I have talked a little bit about that human in the loop process. Typically, that's going to be a case where it makes sense for you to be using AI, right? If it's a same task over and over, like those document uploads, that document scanning, that's usually a good spot. Is the data actually accessible? Again, going back to that scanning example, if I can't pull the information off the documentation, then is that actually accessible for me? And maybe there's some work, some groundwork to actually lay for it to be a process that I can even do. Is there current automation? And if so, does it not work? It's always a good question to ask, right? There might be a process that you have that is already working and you don't need to break something that's not broken. And then most importantly, is there actual impact from this? So yeah, maybe there's a process that's working currently, but it's incredibly manual and it's incredibly cost intensive. That's a good reason to take a stab at it and try and figure out if there's a way to make it better.
Yeah.
Anything to add there?
This is a great checklist. I totally agree with Ryan here. Number 4 is arguably the most important in my head. If you're able to measure the manual workflow, and then you're able to measure in sort of a beta format when you actually introduce any type of AI, how that time, that accuracy, that cost has improved, that's the number one thing that's going to be indicative for you guys to actually leverage these types of technologies. And time again, we've seen that many people have tried number 4 and they failed to actually make it much better by a substantial amount. So if you're seeing 5% accuracy gain, or sorry, 5% time gain, it's probably not worth the amount of effort and maintenance that goes into this process. So just a 2 cents there.
Okay, so this is an example where AI would probably make sense. When we're looking at, say, matching individuals that are on the 314A list to individuals that might be at your institution or transactions that occurred at your institution, this is going to give me a lot of alerts. It's probably going to give me a lot of false positives because I have names that are very similar, potentially addresses that are very similar, or I might have some issues where the types of information that's in a name is just repeated across a lot of different areas, whether it's like limited liability company or some of these things that are hard to train out. So we have an analyst that's going through manually deciding match or no match on each one of those. If any of you have seen the 314A list, you can have 15 of the same name. So now you have 15 alerts for the same person, and you're having to go through and click each one of those individually. So this is an area where we see a lot of repeated work, and it's incredibly human intensive. And so if you were thinking about a way to bring AI in, this is just one example of that. And there's probably a few different ways that you could go about this. Is you can actually take this after the predictive model. So if I have the predictive model giving me the alerts, I could then train a model that is looking at those alerts and saying, well, generally you're marking these as false positives, and it's because of reasons like the name is different in this way, or this person is so geographically distinct from maybe where we would expect that match individual to be, that I know that's going to be a false positive. And from there, you can start to create either accuracy scores or recommendations from an AI model that you can then review and decide on. And that's probably the least invasive approach that you have to bringing this in, but it could save you a lot of time. When we're thinking about, is there even a way to do some of this? Do you have enough labeled data to make those decisions? Are they consistent enough in these cases where it's primarily names and addresses? Maybe some documentation on identification, that's pretty consistent. And then otherwise, is the model actually going to help, or is it just replicating what you've already done? So the last one there, I think, is also incredibly important, which is, do you have any tolerance for false negatives? And the answer is typically, in this case, no. So that's why you might see the use where I have the AI give me a recommendation rather than I have the AI just make the decision for me. Haig, anything to add on that?
Nothing to add. No, you covered it all.
Great. Okay. So key takeaways. You're using AI when it's actually giving you some sort of impact, whether that's financial or time. Predictive AI is and has been around. It's primarily statistics. It's giving ideas about what might be in the future or who might be relevant to a group. For vendors, you want to understand, are they transparent? Can they explain what they're actually working on? And is your data secure? Whether that's generally how they operate or that's your instance specifically. Prefer a glass box model. And to Haig's point, even if it is a black box model, at least understand what's going in and what's coming out. And then lastly, AI should be making your life easier, not making it more complicated. So make sure that you're applying this in a way that actually adds value to you. Anything to add on to that, Haig? Final points?
No final points. I suppose one last thing to double click on here is at every point in any agent that you build or any AI system that you leverage, it's really important that your evaluations are top tier. And I would say I spend a majority of my time in the evaluation step of anything. So I created this technology, it's being used. I need to ensure that I actually have measurable outputs or measurable maybe values that come out of this thing. And what that essentially means is I have spent the time understanding here is a core set, an evaluation set that measures, okay, with this question and this answer, this is the expected output, so that I can go back to that evaluation set and understand whether or not things are being met. So yeah, great job with this.
Excellent. Well, that does bring us to our questions section, which I personally am excited. We've gotten a couple good ones, and if our audience is anything like me, I've already learned a significant amount of this, not only during today's session, but in the research leading up to it. So I might even have some questions here as well. But before we get to that, we've got one final poll question that we've got up for you on the screen now. And that's just asking if you would like to get in touch with Risk Scout about any of the following items. That could be AI, or whether it's BSA, fraud, all the other great things that we do here today. Ryan, myself, we'd all love to hear from you. So let us know if you're interested in that, and we will be sure to follow up. Now, we did have a couple great questions, and I know we touched on this briefly, but Ryan, maybe you can give us a quick high-level answer. What is the difference between machine learning and AI, automated intelligence?
That's kind of a loaded question. But machine learning technically is a type of AI. Really what we're looking at is AI is a broadly applied term in kind of a confusing way. And so you'll see different vendors or different individuals say, yeah, we use AI. And then the general public assumes that means generational AI. But there's a lot of things that people have been using for the past 20 years that would be considered AI, and machine learning is one of those items.
Thank you for that. And Ryan, I think I'll let you piggyback on this.
I think
we had a question
to add on to that.
I just wanted to
go ahead.
One quick thing to that. In the past, like Ryan mentioned, predictive AI, these traditional machine learning models for predictive uses, let's say credit scoring, housing market, etc., they're not as sexy as the recent age of AI, what we refer to as Gen AI, generative AI, which is like ChatGPT. And that's why there's so much buzz and hype around these generative AI types of products. But really, at its core, predictive AI brings a whole lot of value that is now being leveraged with generative AI. So there's a lot of different use cases here, but Ryan was spot on. Yeah.
Excellent. I appreciate that. So what I've wrote down in my notes is less sexy. So that's my key takeaway there. So I appreciate that, Haig. We did have a question, Ryan, I'll throw this to you because it's specifically about Risk Scout, but that we were asked how Risk Scout is leveraging AI. Ryan, I know you're our Chief Product Officer. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah. So we use quite a bit of the on the predictive side, and then we're reviewing a lot of different areas that we are adding in for Gen AI being able to augment some of those predictive models. So how do we reduce the amount of work that somebody that's actually in the system has, and finding the right places where that works in a way that it's explainable, that you're part of the decision-making process, and that when I bring that to a regulator, an auditor, or even to the board of directors at the financial institution, that they understand where it is and they can be comfortable with it. So the goal for us is making sure there's just a few layers there, relative to the amount of complexity that we actually deploy AI with. That way, whatever your risk tolerance is, then you kind of have the option for that risk tolerance.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And of course, if you want more information about RiskOut or how we're using AI, you can always bother Ryan through our website. He's happy to dive a little bit deeper one-on-one there. We got a question actually about not name dropping any vendors, but they said that their vendor has an algorithm that they call proprietary, which has maybe made it hard for them to gather as much information as they'd like to prepare for their exams. How do they navigate that with their regulators?
It's kind of an awkward conversation, to be honest. We had, when I was on the compliance committee at OCC, we had some conversations about that with certain vendors. And a lot of times you could have the regulator reach out directly to the vendor and see if they can get more information, just because it will be more private if it's shared directly with them instead of, say, maybe going through you. If they wholly and outright refuse to provide any information about what's going in, that can be a problem, because even to Haig's point before, like, they can talk about what goes in and what comes out. They don't have to necessarily talk about how all those decisions are made within. Like, you don't need to know how the cake was made. You just need to know the ingredients and what the cake is made out of. So that can be another approach there.
Excellent. Well said there. Haig, I think this might be a good question for you. I know you've worked at a couple different AI companies. We had somebody ask, are there any marketing terms or promotion examples that should raise a red flag when I'm evaluating a vendor? Can you speak to that at all?
Ooh, that's a good question. Nothing comes to mind. I would just, I used to live in San Francisco up until a couple weeks ago. There's a lot of hype, there's a lot of buzz, but at the end of the day, it's really important to understand the value of some of these products. If it's a simple chatbot or if it's a simple thing, it's not worth your time to evaluate unless it's coming down and solving a core problem. So it comes back to product 101. Just, is it solving a core problem for you? And if it's not, don't be influenced by the buzz or the hype or the amount of money they've raised. No marketing terms come to mind, but that's kind of what I would say.
Excellent. Well, I know we're almost at time here, so that is all of the time that we have today for questions. But I do want to thank everyone for joining us, and a big, big thank you to Ryan and Haig for stopping down and sharing their experience with us. We greatly appreciate it. Be sure to keep an eye on your inbox. RiskOut will be sending out the recording, the slides, and the materials that you could download in your inbox first thing tomorrow morning for your convenience. We also do have a brief survey following today's webinar where we can ask you, what you want to see built in AI. You can give us feedback on how we did today, what kind of topics we want to cover in the future. So please take a moment. We would love to hear your thoughts there. If you do have any additional questions, if you want to learn more about RiskOut, you just want to say hi, please visit us at riskout.com. We hope to see you on our next webinar. Haig, Ryan, thank you so much again. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.